Okay, well, let's go on ahead and get started. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the fourth Northeast Cover Crop Council short webinar. I'm Victoria Ackroyd. I'm the program manager for the Northeast Cover Crop Council. My co-host is Susan Roulette, who is with UVM Extension. Today's session qualifies for one half of a crop management CCA CEU. We will put up the slide at the end with the needed information and the QR code. This talk's going to be about 20 minutes long, and at the end of it, there will be time for questions. Feel free to throw questions in the chat as you think of them if you'd like, or at the end, by all means, please feel welcome to speak up. We've got Emily on the line doing captioning for us, hopefully, and so if you need that service, she's going to put a link in the chat that you can click to. This webinar is being recorded. It will be available after the talk with the slides on the University of Vermont Extension website. And so with that, today's speaker is Dr. Sarah Hirsh, who is an extension educator for University of Maryland and Somerset County and an NECCC board member. Her research and extension program focuses on soils, conservation, cover crops, nutrient management, and integrated pest management. Sarah received her PhD in soil science from University of Maryland in 2018, her MS in sustainable agriculture and ecology from Iowa State University in 2012, and her BS in biology and psychology from Grove City College. Sarah aspires to work with farmers to improve the productivity and profitability of agriculture while conserving soil, water, and biodiversity. Sarah, thank you for speaking today. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you everybody for coming out. Let me share my screen. All right. Yeah, so great topic today that they had on the lineup here. I think a lot of farmers deal with this or have a question about whether they should use cover crop mixtures or monocultures and what is the answer. So I'm going to dive into that a bit here today in the first 20 minutes. And as Victoria said, we should have plenty of time for questions. I'll keep an eye on the time to stop right at about 20 minutes for questions and hopefully some discussion at the end. So I work for University of Maryland Extension, and we do get federal funding, and our programs are open to everyone. When we're thinking about deciding between a cover crop mixture and a monoculture, I like to kind of think about it in the framework of overall our cover crop planning and thinking about kind of three things here. So we're going to go through each of these during the presentation. We're going to talk about cover crop purpose, the window that the cover crops fall into between the cash crops. So what is that cover crop window? And then are we being realistic with our selection of cover crop species and what those cover crop species will do and what they will look like? So just being realistic in the expectations will help us decide whether a mixture or a monoculture is going to provide the most benefits for that agricultural operation. So first, thinking about cover crop purpose or the benefits of the cover crop. Really thinking about in the context of the field that you are planning, whether you're a farmer or an ag service provider or in academia. So whatever field is the cover crop going into, what are the primary purposes of that cover crop in the field? And we kind of recommend selecting one or two purposes. So no cover crop is going to achieve all of these benefits. So what are the top priorities for the cover crop? And determining that will help to determine whether a mixture or monoculture is the best cover crop for that situation. So the advantage of a mixed species cover crop over single species cover crop for whatever goal you have in mind is that the mixed species tend to help to achieve more purposes. So if you're looking at that previous slide and you think, well, I really want to do these three purposes. So a mix may be the best answer for you. But if you're thinking, well, my number one and top priority for this field is to deal with this herbicide resistant weed. Well, in that case, a single species may be the answer. So it depends on how many purposes you're trying to achieve. Mixed cover crops will allow for more functional groups in that mix. So a functional group meaning like a legume would have a different function than a grass or a winter cereal cover crop. So if your purpose calls for multiple functional groups, then a mix. Mixed cover crop species can encompass more seasonal niches. So if you have a longer time period that you want the cover crop, a mix can help to cover that, the growth in the field for that longer time period. And mixes can allow for more balanced carbon to nitrogen ratios, especially if you want a particular species that may have a very high carbon content. A mix may be the answer to include like a legume. And I'll go into each of these in more detail. And then finally, a mixed species can allow for more adaptability to site variability, seasonal variability, or seed variability. So just giving you a bit more, like a bit more of a buffer if something goes wrong. So here's an example of a mixed species having more purposes. So this is a forage radish here, which the purpose would be biodrilling, maybe scavenging nitrogen, reducing compaction. Then it has triticale as a winter cereal, which is going to have that fibrous rooting system and help building organic matter. And it has a crimson clover, which is a legume going to be fixing nitrogen and adding nitrogen to that system. So this is just an example showing how the mix is going to provide multiple functional groups, multiple purposes. More seasonal niches. So in certain regions of the country, a species like forage radish would winter kill. So it's really only fitting into that fall, into the early winter seasonal niche. But if you want a cover crop that's going to have growth and be adding benefits in the spring, then adding in other species like a winter cereal that would overwinter would be a good choice. So here you see that same mixture in the fall and in the spring. The radish has winter killed. This is in Maryland, but you can see the crimson clover and the triticale really taking off in the spring there. Thinking about balancing your carbon to nitrogen ratio. So this is really important, especially if you want your cover crop to release nitrogen to the following crop. For example, if you have corn following a cover crop. So you really want to have some of the nitrogen picked up or fixed by the cover crop to be available to that corn crop. And you don't want the nitrogen to be tied up. So if we think about the carbon to nitrogen ratio of the different species, rye can have anywhere from about 26 to 1 to all the way up to 82 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, depending on how mature you let that grow. Whereas if you added in a species like hairy vetch, cover crop, that's going to have a carbon to nitrogen ratio all the way down around 11 to 1. You mix those two together. So you mix about half pollinating rye with early bloom vetch, and you end up with that ideal microbial diet. So kind of that gold star carbon to nitrogen ratio of 24 to 1, where the nitrogen from that cover crop would be available to, say, a following corn crop. So that's the idea in kind of balancing the carbon and nitrogen by selecting species in a mix. So that could be advantage of doing a mixed species cover crop. Here's another example, just comparing a winter cereal monoculture cover crop to a mixed cover crop, and then also to a radish monoculture cover crop. So if you look at this graph here, what we're seeing is the spring soil nitrate following various cover crops. And this is measured in the soil here on the y-axis from the surface all the way down to 210 centimeters, which is about 7 feet deep. So about surface down to 7 feet deep, this is the amount of nitrate in the soil in the spring following growing these different cover crops or no cover crop control. The no cover crop control is the black line here, and you can see from the surface all the way down to 7 feet deep, significantly more nitrate in that soil compared to all of your cover crop treatments. And this was averaged over 11 farm sites. Now, if we look at the difference between the different cover crops, I really want to focus here on the winter cereal monoculture, which is the green line, and the blue line, which is the mixed species. So here we could see that in the deeper layers, they both did a nice job at reducing the deep soil nitrate, which is what we want to kind of reduce that environmental impact of the nitrate leaching. However, on the soil surface, this is where the difference laid. So as I mentioned with the carbon to nitrogen ratio, following the winter cereal cover crop, there was a lot less available nitrate on the soil surface in the spring compared to that mixed species cover crop, which often would include the legume and the radish and some of the lower carbon to nitrogen ratio species. So those tended to have more available nitrate on the soil surface in the spring. And dependent on that spring crop, you may or may not want that available nitrate on the soil surface. So again, it comes back to the rotation and the goal for the cover crop. Is a goal for the cover crop to leave available nitrate on the soil surface in the spring? If so, then a mixed species would be better than a winter cereal. Here's another problem, however. So this is a herbicide-resistant ragweed, and actually that is a soybean field in October. You can barely see the soybean. I think there's one right there. But it's totally overrun with herbicide-resistant ragweed. So how can we use a cover crop to help address this issue? So in this case, perhaps a monoculture rye would be the solution. Especially this field that you see here was a long-term continuous soybean field, and he planned to continue to go into soybean the next field. So assuming that you do not have a crop like corn that needs the legume credits, a monoculture rye may be the best answer. So letting a rye crop grow very mature, maybe rolling that down, forming that thick mulch through the following year's soybean growing season, that can help to address that herbicide-resistant ragweed, cut back on the ragweed emergence, and help control that weed. So in this case, there's not a big justification or argument to plant a mixed species. A monoculture winter cereal may be the best choice. So now getting into how the cover crop fits into the cash crop rotation or the cover crop window. So I'm going to give a few examples here. This is a farm in Cecil County, Maryland, and this is his cash crop rotation. He does 2 years of corn, followed by a year of soybeans, followed by wheat for harvest. And then after, he does cover crops in between all of those, but I'm going to focus on after his wheat for harvest. Rather than planting a double crop soybean crop, which a lot of farmers will do in Maryland, this farmer decided to focus on building his soil in this field and on his farm, and he wanted to plant a warm, cool season cover crop mix that is actually growing from the time he harvests the wheat in early July through the following fall, where it would then go back to year one corn on that field. And so in this case, it's a very long growing season for that cover crop, and a mix really makes much more sense than any kind of monoculture cover crop, because you can include species with multiple seasonal niches, you can include multiple functional groups, all of those things that we talked about before. So he plants a cover crop mix that includes some summer species, some fall species. About half of the species will die off before or during the winter, and then he still has a robust cover crop growing with those cool season species through the following spring until he goes back into corn. And that's what his summer cover crop looked like in that field. You could see here the sun hemp, which is legume, so that would be a summer species, but there's also cool season species there. Here's another example, and I want to focus on this little cover crop window right here. So this is a vegetable farmer who is growing cucurbits, and then maybe the following spring, tomato, pepper, eggplants in the beds. But he was looking for a short cover crop right here in this window, kind of from when he harvests the cucurbits until planting a fall cover crop. So he chose to plant buckwheat, and buckwheat is one that will do great in that window. It's very rapidly growing, but it also will quickly go to seed, and so it doesn't do great in a mix because it tends to go to seed, which could cause a weed problem before the other species in that mix would have a chance to really develop and be worthwhile. So here's a picture of that monoculture buckwheat cover crop, and within the context of his situation and his rotation, this made the most sense in that window. Now thinking about farmer expectations. So cover crops are going to look very different based on a lot of different factors. So even if it's the same mix, it'll look very different. So we want to be realistic about what the monoculture or the mix will actually look like in the context of the situation. And also things like what planting equipment is available. Do you have equipment to deal with residue? So here's a roller crimper. In this case, they have equipment to roll it down. This is an organic operation. Another thing to keep in mind about whether a mix is worthwhile. Are you really dependent on that legume in the mix for the nitrogen? Are you organic? But thinking about how you're going to plant the cash crop, how you're going to plant the cover crop, how you're going to terminate the cover crop. Do you have the time and the equipment to deal with cover crop residue? If not, then maybe something like a monoculture forage radish would be the answer, because that would winter kill in a lot of regions and quickly decompose, and you don't have to deal with the residue of that other species in the mix. So back to our example of the summer cover crop, the multi-species mix. Is he prepared to deal with that biomass in the spring? In some cases, the answer would be no on some operations. Here's another example of a mixed cover crop species that was wheat and vetch ahead of corn. So a lot of farmers may be hesitant to plant corn into a field that looked like that with the waist-high vetch. He had the equipment that he was comfortable doing it, and he had good results. That was his cornfield, and you can see even later in August in that following corn crop, he had a nice residue on that surface from the wheat. The vetch did help him to reduce his nitrogen inputs. So that mix was a good fit for him, but that may be because he had the equipment to handle it. Do the species complement each other in the mix? So I mentioned how buckwheat often does not have good complementary species that you could mix with buckwheat. So if for whatever purpose you're set on using buckwheat, then it's probably a good idea to do that one as a monoculture. And then how are you managing the mix? So this is kind of the last point here. Even the same mix managed differently can end in different results. So this is what this cover crop is: triticale, crimson clover, and forage radish. The forage radish overwintered, so that's what you see here with the white flowers. But the forage radish was planted in 30-inch rows, right where the following corn crop would be planted, with the crimson clover and the triticale broadcast in between. So this is a good situation. So if your goal is to reduce compaction with that forage radish, then in some cases a monoculture would be the answer, because especially an early planted forage radish is going to really take over and can outcompete the other species in the mix, or make it not really worthwhile to plant them, especially if your primary goal is to alleviate compaction and you want like a nice thick stand of forage radish. However, if you plant it in the rows, then you're still getting that benefit of alleviating compaction, but you don't have to worry about that early planted forage radish outcompeting the other species, and you can get additional benefits of the other species in between those rows. So that, again, is coming back to, if you have the equipment and the time to do that management, then a mix may be the ideal situation. If not, maybe a monoculture forage radish is going to be the best case for you. So in summary, we want to focus on our purpose and our window, and practicality first and diversity next. So I would kind of say, like, the default, probably a mix is going to be better, going to provide more purposes, but definitely not all the time. And it's really important to go through that planning process, thinking about your purpose and your window and what is practical for your operation in that field. So here is my contact information. If you have a minute to rate my teaching, I always appreciate that. And I will open it up for questions.
Thank you, Sarah. So we did have a question, will the slides be available? And generally our speakers have been very amenable to putting up the slides. So hopefully
Sure.
that'll be okay with you too.
Yep.
Awesome, thank you.
Yep, definitely.
So they'll be posted in the same place as the webinar recording on the UVM extension website. Susan's been pretty fast usually about getting them up ahead of time. And she put the link in the chat right there. Thank you. So with that bit of housekeeping out of the way, we do have several minutes for questions. Does anyone want to speak up? What is the model name of the shark teeth planter? Anna asks.
I would have to ask the farmer that. I don't think it was on the photo. Yeah, I would have to check with him, but I can get that information if I get her contact information.
Thank you. Okay, so that was Anna Biddle asking that. So you're in Maryland. You provided some really great information about, what to be careful of in terms of, for example, not mixing buckwheat. Somebody else has put another message down here. Let's see. Looks like it may be Yetter, Michael Murphy says, with regard to the shark teeth planter. What's your favorite?
Oh yeah, and
Sorry.
it's actually, it says 2967. Yetter, 2967.
Thank you.
Yep.
Here's one. Jason asks, what are your thoughts on the 6 and 8-way mixes?
So that the picture I showed of that one, that was actually a 10-way mix, and he's real happy with it. He kind of has like, multiple legumes and multiple winter cereals and multiple brassicas. I think there's turnip and radish in there. So, I mean, on one hand, having the 6, 8, 10-way mixes, it does provide, duplicates. If say one brassica doesn't do well, you have a backup for another one. Or if one legume doesn't do well, you have a backup for another one. It's not really my default recommendation for farmers. So I would say, if you're looking to do a mix, you're probably going to get good benefits from just focusing on maybe one winter cereal, one legume, and a brassica if that makes sense. But I'm not sure, like, you get a whole lot of extra benefits from including multiple legumes. But then again, it could have to do with your goals. So if you really need the nitrogen from that cover crop, maybe you want to have a backup legume in there in case one doesn't do so well.
Thank you. So another hot topic, what about cover crops for forage?
Yeah, I saw a few like grazing specialists on this call, so I don't know if they want to speak up here, because I have not done too much with that. But I think again, just looking at the nutrition of them, the carbon to nitrogen ratio, avoiding certain species. I don't know if anyone else wants to speak up on the call.
Amanda says also timing of grazing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we do have a couple more minutes if anyone else has some questions.
I'd ask a question. Is that all right?
Yes, please do, Ken.
Sure. So on the C to N part, so a lot of your pictures of how the spring management was done, it was, the residue stayed on the top.
Mm-hmm.
Then you showed some pictures later in the season and the residue still laying on the top. And it usually was, stuff that was killed late, looked like straw.
Yeah.
So how does that C to high, C to N residue, if it's left on top, in terms of its interaction with the microbes and tying up in, it seems like if you leave it on top, maybe it doesn't really matter that it's, it's not going to really tie up soil in if it's just on top. I mean, so the tillage versus no till, in the C to N ratio? How's that work out?
So the studies that I've looked at with that, and there was another slide I wish I included, but there was one on the yield, the corn yield following, so that for the same farms that go back to that slide. Let's see here. So this one. The same farms that this study was done on, we also looked at the corn yield following the winter cereal monoculture versus the mix or the radish. And the winter cereal monoculture tended to have a higher carbon to nitrogen. And all of these farms were in Maryland or Pennsylvania, and they were no-till. So the residue was left on the surface. And there was a trend that with no nitrogen fertilization, corn yield suffered after the winter cereal monocultures compared to the mixed species. So even though it was left on the soil surface, it still affected the corn yield negatively. So I guess some of it is still kind of tying up that nitrogen based on that data set.
All right. Yep. Thanks.
But that, I mean, that's a good point, and I would think, you know, being tilled in, it would be even quicker decomposition and even more tied up, even more, or be even more available. So, yeah.
All right. Yeah. Thanks.
So probably relevant to that question, Ken, I just threw in the website address for our CCN Calc tool, which I believe Sarah may have been involved with helping to provide data for that tool. It tells you biomass decomposition and nitrogen release from your cover crop, and that is in the case of residue that's been left on the surface. If you don't want to have to ballpark, you know, what numbers you think you're dealing with and just want to play with it, there are example data already in the tool. If you go to the top right after you pick your location, there's a drop-down box that lets you pick. So just so that you can see, because the charts are very interactive at the end with the output telling you how much nitrogen and residue you have after any given amount of time after that cover crop termination during the growing season. And sorry for hijacking the call to plug one of our tools, but does anyone else have any questions? Okay, well, it is 12:30 on the dot, and we do try to be respectful of people's time. So Susan did have up the slide with the information that you need for CCA CEU. Is registration the right word? To log it anyway. There it is again. There's the slide. Thank you, Susan. So with that, I'm going to say thank you so much for speaking today, Sarah. And thank you to everyone else to attending. And I'm going to stop recording. And we're gonna call it a session. Hopefully we'll see you on the next one next week.